Hello, my name is Tom Coleman, and I'm the executive director of the Birds of a Feather project of Spectrum Institute. And the project is focusing on LGBT legal advocacy in the 1970s. And we're honoring and recognizing what I call the trailblazers and pioneers of that era, law students and lawyers who were active in LGBT rights and advancing the cause in a decade that was quite hostile to our communities. So it took some courage to do that. We're going to be having several events during LGBT History Month for this project. And one of them is a webinar, another is a memory book. With me today is María Reyes Olmedo, who will introduce herself in a moment, but she's a law student. They are a law student. Maria is non-binary. So I asked Maria to do some research and to write a chapter for the memory book about the emergence of non-binary, transgender, and BIPOC students, which is basically students of color, Indigenous and Black and students of color, when they emerged, why they emerged, because what I found in my research was that there were really very few open LGBT advocates who were transgender or BIPOC students or lawyers during the 1970s. And they didn't really, and I didn't find any non-binary. There probably were some, but because people have been around forever, right? In whatever categories. Maria's written a chapter for the book, and Maria will talk about that today on this interview. A portion of that will be shown at the webinar. I'm going to ask Maria to please introduce themselves to the audience, and we'll take it from there.
Hi, hello. My name is María Reyes Olmedo. I am a 3L at Loyola Law School. I'm a public interest scholar, and my goal is to work in public interest after graduation, and that is informed by my being formerly undocumented and low income and first generation higher education student.
Before we go on, especially for the longer version of this interview, there are going to be some people who will see this or listen to this and aren't really familiar with some of the terms that we'll be using. Non-binary, transgender, and BIPOC are some of them. You might have others that you want to share. Could you give us a brief definition of those terms as you use them?
Definitions vary. Different people use different terms differently, but the generally accepted definition of non-binary is a person who does not identify within the gender binary, so neither female nor male. And there are different identities within non-binary, like agender or gender fluid. Transgender is a term for people whose identity does not conform with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Also, if we use the term queer, it's as an umbrella for people who are not heterosexual or cisgender. And BIPOC is meant to include Black, Indigenous, and people of color. It's a term specifically used in the United States, and it's intended to center the experiences of Black and Indigenous peoples in the United States while showing solidarity between communities of color.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. I know that what I was using decades ago and sometimes still do, rather than the word queer as an umbrella, is the term sexual minorities, which encompasses all of the variations that are not the majority. And the majority, of course, is the heterosexual norm, so to speak. So different generations have used different terminologies, but right now, today, we're speaking to the current generation. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the chapter that you've written for the memory book, about your research, the people you interviewed, and what you discovered.
Well, I had the chance to write a chapter in the memory book of Birds of a Feather. I wrote about the emergence of transgender, non-binary, and BIPOC law students and legal scholars within the LGBTQIA+ activism movement. And I saw that there was a rise in this involvement after the civil rights movement, which pushed higher education, including law schools, to adopt affirmative action programs. And this resulted in people attending law school being slightly more diverse, mainly around race, which is also very interconnected with class. So this resulted in activism from queer BIPOC law students becoming more visible in the decades following the civil rights movement, and more so after the 1970s, when the queer activism was mostly coming from white law students and lawyers and legal professionals in general. So I included both that historical narrative and then also biographical narratives from law students, lawyers, and legal professors. They included transgender law student, a transgender lawyer, also a gay African-American law professor, various non-binary law students, as well as a non-binary lawyer.
Back in the 70s, when I was active, the overwhelming majority of those when conferences started occurring, when organizations started forming and there were boards of directors and so on, at first it was overwhelmingly male and overwhelmingly white. And then there started to be more women, lesbians, getting involved on boards of directors and in movements, in the movement. It seemed that women were more focused on feminism and women's rights issues. And as one history professor told me in an interview, that one of the reasons he felt that there wasn't a larger number of BIPOC students and lawyers involved in LGBT rights isn't that they weren't interested in it, but that their priorities were such that there was so much racism and classism and so on going on that they felt that was a higher priority. And a lot of they were joining organizations that made those issues a priority. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, very much so. I think there is that initial reaction to focus on what seems more pressing, and oftentimes our gender identity or sexual orientation is not visible. So, however, we cannot hide our race. If somebody is experiencing racism just based on their appearance, I think it makes sense for them to try to focus on that first and kind of like push their queer activism to the side. Even to this day, I think that is happening within the queer activism arena, as Rafael Rangel Osuna mentioned, because there is so much violence against trans people, especially trans women. A lot of trans activists focus primarily on trans activism and trying to bring attention to the disproportionate violence that sector of community faces. They may not engage with other focuses of the queer activism movement as much.
And then tell us your thoughts about what does intersectionality mean when that's used, and also your thoughts about the importance of coalition building and working with other communities for the LGBT community to advance the goals of other communities, minority communities, and enlisting minority communities to advance our goals. So talk about both intersectionality for like an individual, and then the idea of coalition building and what you think about that.
So intersectionality acknowledges the fact that we embody different identities at one time. For example, I am a law student, I am Latinx, I am non-binary, and all of those identities happen simultaneously, and all of those things influence my experience as a person. Regarding coalition building, there is power in numbers, and if we, instead of focusing on what may be most visible, or instead of just thinking that we can only focus on one issue at a time, we can instead unite over what we have in common or what issues we are passionate about. And for example, right now, there's a lot of attention regarding class and race. However, I feel like in the public sphere, race has been more prevalent, but also everybody has a class. We exist within a class, within the capitalist system. So if we united across our respective classes, I think because so many of us are low income, we could push for change in that arena, or to raise a minimum wage, or to bring attention to the issues that we are passionate about. So the same can apply to queer activism. It doesn't only affect queer people, it also affects the constitutional rights of everybody. Thinking about how the basic humanity of people is so important, and we can work together to uphold our rights as human beings.
I recall back in the 70s when I was trying to get then Governor Jerry Brown to take some action. He gave me some advice, and he said the key to political success is transforming 10% support into 60% support. And he said you do that by broadening the issue to something that encompasses more people than just you. It helps more people. It helps you too, but it's a more generic issue, and building coalitions. And so it seems like that's consistent, I think, with what you're saying. Doesn't that seem like the same message, but just with a slightly different twist?
Yes, finding a way to make it personal to everybody, or everybody can identify with it or see how it could affect them.
Yeah, I remember back in the early 80s into mid 80s pushing for hate crime legislation. And at that time, we had a conservative Republican governor right after Jerry Brown left office. We had George Deukmejian, and with a legislature that was heavily Republican. So the strategy changed, in my view, as to what issues to push. So I thought, where's the commonality? And I thought, freedom from violence. We should be able to reach some consensus on freedom from violence. So some people were pushing to add sexual orientation to the hate crime statute, which was appropriate. But I said, let's add age, disability, and sexual orientation. Age and disability primarily because people are victimized because of actual or perceived vulnerability. And to some extent, the LGBT community was victimized partially because of hate and homophobia, but also because of perceived vulnerability. So we did that. And by doing that, it enabled a conservative Republican governor to sign the bill, and thereby having the first sexual orientation hate crime in the nation. And I kind of doubt if he would have done that if it had just been sexual orientation. So we worked together. So anyway, that's my little anecdote on this. Moving forward a little bit, I encourage people to read the book, the memory book, and especially to read your chapter, especially the biographies of some of the individuals, which are fascinating. And it shows that what did you learn when what could you share with us about the significance of some of the people you interviewed not wanting to have their full names or their real names disclosed or shared with the public, or not wanting to have their photos shared with the public? It kind of reminds me of where I was at in the 1960s before I got, decided to really come out and jump into the movement, and where a lot of people have been along the path of coming out. It's kind of a spectrum, little by little by little. Some people jump out all the way. Some people are yanked out of the closet all the way. But what does it tell you about, in this day and age, that there are still people who do not feel comfortable publicly sharing who they are?
I think the book tries to have an overall positive feeling, but I think some people choosing to not disclose their names shows the reality that not everybody has that privilege, because it is a privilege. Some people's reasoning was they're trying to think about their possible future employers, I know one person is not out to their family and they did not feel comfortable being outed in this way. They wanted to share that with their family when they were ready. Like you mentioned, some people do it little by little. Like it was not until after finishing this project that I included my pronouns in my signature, in my email signature. So it has been also like the journey, and it also helped me feel more comfortable with disclosing my pronouns in that way. I also found it very helpful to share experiences with other people and building community that way. I learned I am not the only one that feels this way. I became more conscious of how various people feel that invisibility, and that also contributes to them not wanting to come out because they see how other people, they are constantly misgendered or their identity is not valued or it's disregarded because they don't present in a way that's conventionally associated with that gender.
Looking forward, where we are today, and there's a lot of, let's say, resistance by segments of the public to the gains that the LGBT community has made. Some are trying to roll them back. Some successfully are putting obstacles in our way to full equality and inclusion in society and a freedom to be who we are and all of that. I guess some say that the quote, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." What would you say to this current generation of lawyers and law students, whether they're LGBT or not, about the position we are in society today and their role as we move forward, the opportunities for them, the challenges for them, any advice you'd like to share as well?
I think that with knowledge comes responsibility. It is not many queer and BIPOC people who reach this level of education. And I think we should make good use of it, of our privileged position, bring attention to the issues that are affecting minority communities, going back to intersectionality and building community, building unity among different communities. So I think that we should use our knowledge and our influence to either personally dedicate ourselves either through pro bono hours or working in nonprofit organizations that push for legislation change or to who represent queer people, or just on our as the like non-lawyers in our non-legal capacity to just do community work and to do outreach to either support queer rights or just support like constitutional and human rights in general.
It sounds great. Is there anything else issues that I haven't raised, or any other thoughts that you would like to share before we either personal or more generic that you'd like to share with the audience before we conclude?
Just I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to work in this project. It was very educational and it was a growing experience for me. It allowed me to connect with different legal professionals that I would have not connected with otherwise in other states, in various stages of their career. It showed me that I don't have to separate my personal identity from my profession or from my being a student, that I can show up as my true self in whatever situation I'm in.
Even
Thank
though
you.
it's slightly off topic, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure working with you on this project as well as the previous one. And even though it's slightly off topic, can you say something about the article you're writing for about conservatorship? Is that developing or?
It's going to be published in the Loyola Law Review Developments issue in spring 2023.
And what's the topic?
Yes, I wrote about conservatorship reform in California following AB 1194, and I'm arguing that every person who is possibly going to be placed in a conservatorship should be appointed counsel automatically.
Good. Yeah, and then hopefully the attorneys will follow the law and provide zealous advocacy rather than just shuffling paperwork and pretending to be a real advocate. So thank you for advancing that issue, because it's something very, as you know, very near and dear to my heart. Okay, so then we're going to conclude this interview, and thank you very much, Maria, for spending the time today with us. And we'll be sharing this far and wide over in the future. I'll look forward to working with you again on something else, especially once you get your law degree and really start shaking things up as a lawyer.